Welcome to PixelTunesradio, a podcast where we have fun talking about video games and video game music. I'm Ed.
And I'm not Mike.
He's not Mike. This dude just kind of randomly walked into my house and said, let's do a podcast, so here he is.
I was driving down the road and I just had this epiphany, this sort of intuition that somebody in this house is doing a podcast.
Well, there was a tag sale across the street, so you stopped at the tag sale and you were like, I think I hear a podcast going on.
I was trying to look for some video games. No luck, of course. And here I am.
Ta-da!
I'm Todd, by the way.
Yes, this is Todd.
You may have heard me on other such episodes as Zelda, Metroid, Todd's Picks.
You were on Todd's Picks?
I was on Todd's Picks.
I keep forgetting that. Anyhow, yes, so Mike is getting married very soon, so he's taking a little bit of a break from PixelTunes. For the next couple episodes, I'm going to have some guest hosts on with me, and Todd has been gracious enough to join our show for the day. Today's episode is number 67, Industrial Strength VGM, and we kind of figured we'd do a show on industrial music because Todd and I are both big fans of the genre. It's a genre that not a lot of people understand and that kind of maybe gets a bad rep from people that don't really have a lot of familiarity with it. So we're going to play a whole bunch of tracks from a whole bunch of different games, a whole bunch of different types of industrial music, and hopefully we can turn some of you guys onto the music. If you don't like the first couple tracks, keep listening because there's a whole lot of different types of sounds that you're going to hear throughout this whole show. So, Todd, first of all, how would you define industrial music?
That's one hell of a question. Is the genre defunct now? Because I don't know that industrial, as we knew it when we were, say, teenagers, exists, or at least it's not called that anymore.
Yeah, there are some bands that still try to bring back the old sound.
I know KMFDM is still around, and of course 9 Inch Nails is still occasionally releasing music, but even 9 Inch Nails has sort of moved on from what it used to be, what it was when I became a fan. Not that I'm not anymore, but it is a different beast now.
Yeah.
Industrial, at least when I started liking it, listening to it, was sort of industrial rock. It was drums and heavy chugging guitars and catchy riffs to that end, with lots of synths and ambient noises and sort of dour sort of kind of sounds, that sort of thing, compiled together into amazing music.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description. For me, I've always kind of defined it as many instruments that you don't normally hear played together making a song. Yeah. So, you'll hear in many of our tracks today kind of like aggressive dance beats mixed with heavier rock or metal guitars. Like you buy a guitar, guitars are made to be played in a rock band, and synths are made to be, done for dance or R&B or stuff like that. But nobody has really combined them together until like the past 10 or 15 years or so. And so I've always kind of defined it as a group of instruments that don't really belong together, harmonizing and playing with each other, normally with, like you said, more of a angry or a sad kind of a mood. Very, very heavy beats, very chuggy guitars, although sometimes you might even get industrial that is more beautiful than it is angry, and we'll have some of those tracks as we go on today too. So the track that brought us in today was Ozar Midrashim, and that is from Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, so the first Soul Reaver game that came out. That was on the PlayStation in 1999. And it's the song that kind of brings the game in. It's a very well-known track. I know a lot of our listeners are very familiar with it. It's one of my favorite industrial songs ever. It's very sweeping. It has lots of orchestral and cinematic elements, but I love that kind of... It sounds almost like somebody's playing a percussion kit made out of like treasure chests or something like that.
Yeah, having never played the game before and listening to this track before we actually started recording, I've decided that I need to play Soul Reaver.
Yes,
because that was really good. I was not familiar with that song. I have never heard it before, at least to my memory, and I really liked it.
Yeah, Kurt Harland composed this song. He is one of 3 composers on the game. The other 2 were Greg Shaw and Jim Hedges. A lot of the rest of the soundtrack doesn't sound too much like this. It's actually more ambient, more cinematic and orchestral sounding. Harland has 2 tracks in this game, and they are kind of modifications of tracks that originally came out on an album that he wrote for Information Society called Don't Be Afraid. And it's an album that I've had forever. I personally had the album before I even knew that these songs were in the game, so I was like super thrilled when I found out that this particular track like introduced the Soul Reaver game. But he's also done lots of other music for other games too. He helped compose the soundtrack for X-Men 2 Clone Wars on the Genesis, Scooby-Doo Mystery, Nightmare Circus, which was a Genesis game that I think was only available via the Sega channel. He did some stuff for Gex 3D Enter the Gecko, and then after 1999 in Soul Reaver, he worked on sound design for Soul Reaver 2, Legacy of Kain Blood Omen 2, and then Whiplash and Legacy of Kain Defiance. He was audio lead on those two games. So, the album that he put out that has this particular track on it is a very industrial sounding album. A lot of the music does sound a lot like this. He does a really cool cover of Gary Newman's Our Friends Electric, puts a little bit more of a dance spin on it.
When you hear a slow, sort of growing, quiet theme, and then you hear that tick, 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 tick start up, that you're in for a ride.
Yeah, those little hi-hats. He used a lot of MIDI, actually, with this soundtrack, according to the liner notes that are in the CD on the album. So he's more of a tech geek. Like, he was one of the first guys. At the end of the Don't Be Afraid album, there's like a series of white noise, and it's actually a modem terminal command. If you connect your modem with an open line to the internet and you play this track off of the CD, it will connect to a BBS and download an additional track to your hard drive. And This was back in 1997, so it was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
So he was well ahead of his time as far as tech goes, and that really shows in his music. So, all right, let's move into our next track. This is a Super Nintendo track. This one is from Firepower 2000. This is the opening track from David Whittaker. All right, welcome back. That was the opening track from Firepower 2000 on the Super Nintendo, released in 1992, and that was from David Whittaker. What'd you think, Todd?
That was good. I got a solid Metroid vibe off of that in the first,
yeah, you're right. I didn't
15
even think
seconds.
about it.
I actually thought you started playing the wrong track for a minute, and then it kicked into the actual song, and I said, nope, this isn't Metroid, but I really got like a Metroid, a Super Metroid vibe off of that.
With those, definitely with those kind of like rolling thunder sounds, same kind of thing that Super Metroid used a lot.
Yep.
This to me had more of a sound of like early to mid 80s European industrial, like Falco and Berlin, a lot of that new wave kind of stuff with those very heavy beats with that kind of rolling bass line. It's much more synth heavy than a lot of the industrial music that a lot of people are used to. But again, the keyboard tones are just, they swing up and down. It has more of kind of like a sad or a melancholy feel to it. This whole soundtrack is very similar to this opening tune, but the rest of them are, because the game is a vertical shooter, a lot of them are much more energetic sounding, so they're much more kind of a synth pop. I felt like this one had more of a melancholy kind of a industrial feel to it. So the game was originally an Amiga game called Swiv, and it had a completely different soundtrack on the Amiga. And so David Whittaker was the composer for the Super Nintendo version, kind of made an entirely new set of music for it. And David Whittaker, I think we've talked about him on the show before. He's just been composing since the early C64 days. He has hundreds and hundreds of soundtracks to his name. He's one of the most prolific and one of the most well-respected composers out there as far as VGM goes.
That would explain why I've never heard this track before, because it being a vertical shooter, they're not my jam.
Yeah.
They're just not my kind of game, so I'm not familiar with this game whatsoever, but good song.
Yeah, it's a pretty basic game. The cool thing about it is you can play as either a helicopter or kind of like a four-wheeled Jeep tank kind of deal. And so your gameplay will vary depending on which vehicle you choose to go through the levels. Or you can do two players, one having each type of vehicle. And the ground vehicle can shoot in multiple directions, or, hold in one direction if you just hold the shoot button down. While the helicopter plays more like a standard vertical shooter would, where it's always firing forward, but has more of kind of like a spread shot. So it's fun to play. It's really, really hard. And it's not too long. Amiga games back then weren't really that long to begin with. The graphics have a very Amiga feel to it, whereas lots of kind of like bright but still kind of muted colors, and everything's got very rounded edges like a lot of those later Amiga games do. So it's worth a play and definitely worth checking out. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we got into industrial music to begin with, because I wasn't born listening to this stuff. It didn't exist when I was born. So where did you first hear, your first industrial song, or do you even remember, Todd?
I do. My first quote-unquote industrial album was Nine Inch Nails' Downward Spiral. Closer, as everybody knows, got a lot of radio play, but it was really the rest of the album that caught me. I was listening to this album and just, songs like Ruiner and Reptile. I suspect you know a little bit about Ruiner, given that your online moniker is Ruiner9.
Yep.
Just really sounded so amazing to me, and from there I had to just seek out more, so I started getting into things like KMFDM and those sorts of bands. And that was a big part of what I listened to for, the latter half of my teen years and probably the first few years of my 20s. Not that I don't listen to it now, but, I'm older now. My tastes have evolved somewhat.
Yeah, it's harder to come by now, too. Like you said before, the genre is not what it used to be, so it's kind of like we've almost outgrown it in a sense. I had always kind of had a predilection for this kind of music, I guess, because I remember when I was a kid, there was a Duran Duran track called Wild Boys, and the video was very kind of like Mad Max. It was like a bunch of screaming guys with spikes all over them and a huge water wheel in the middle, and it was just a very aggressive kind of synth-led and guitar-led track. And I really liked it. I had no idea that genre was even in existence. I just thought it was one of their more aggressive songs. And then a while later, there's a pop vocalist named Suzanne Vega. She came out with a song called Blood Makes Noise, which had a very industrial beat to it. And I really liked that. So I kept kind of hanging up on these random tracks that sounded very industrial here and there. And then I think it was the Mortal Kombat movie came out. And the soundtrack had KMFDM, it had Sister Machine Gun, it had Psychosonic, it had a whole bunch of different industrial bands like Fear Factory, which was on the way heavier side of the industrial spectrum. And so I got it because I really like that, Mortal Kombat, that techno song that everybody knows. But I listened to the rest of the album and I was blown away by all of the music. So I think that's the first time and probably the only time ever where I went out and bought every single album of every single band that was on that soundtrack and just liked everything that was on there. And from then on, I just kind of started following these bands, and I was like, well, a lot of these bands are on the same label. It's either Cleopatra or Metropolis or Wax Trax Records. And so I started looking up these labels and noticing that they were industrial record labels. So I would go seek out other bands, and from there it just kind of expanded and sought out all of these different industrial bands and kind of like became not like an expert on the genre, but just wanted to know more and more and more and more about it. I did eventually cross paths with Nine Inch Nails, because when you're into industrial music, you're eventually going to get there, and absolutely fell in love with Nine Inch Nails music. So we went out and got, I think my first album was Downward Spiral, same as yours. And then I just went back and got, the Broken EP and Pretty Hate Machine and all of the singles and all of the EPs and all the European, totally went completely insane. I must have had a lot of expendable income back then, because I can't afford all that stuff now. But, then I just amassed this huge collection, and now I've got, between 300 and 400 industrial CDs in my house, and it's everything's awesome. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. I think KMFDM on that Mortal Kombat soundtrack is a song called Juke Joint Jezebel, one of their most popular tracks. Really kind of sucked me in and really kind of became the benchmark that all other industrial bands for me were kind of compared to, because they have a very danceable beat, very almost like danceable guitars too. They're heavy, but they're very rhythmic. It's like heavy metal that you can go out on a dance floor and dance to, kind of a deal. There were a lot of other guest vocalists on that album, like Pig, and I think the guys from Sister Machine Gun, some of them were on that album as well. And so I was really surprised when we started kind of compiling tracks for this show that KMFDM actually wrote the soundtrack for Spider-Man 2, which came out in 2004. I had no idea that they wrote music specifically for a video game. Did you know anything about that, Todd?
That's news to me.
Yeah.
I'll have to listen to the rest of this soundtrack. Going back for a minute to talking about getting into the music, I started with Nine Inch Nails, which, I guess wasn't your path, but Trent wasn't releasing music fast enough for me. I'm an angsty teen.
Oh, he would come out with an album every 5 years or so.
Right. And so Downward Spiral is out, and I've listened to it to death, thousands of times or whatever. But I want more. I'm angsty. I'm angry. I'm 18 and I'm stupid. And so I go to the store and I start buying anything that's on his record label, Nothing.
Ah, okay.
And
Marilyn Manson,
and among those was Pig, Sensation. Right. I'd never heard of Pig before. I didn't know that Raymond Watts was the vocalist at the time for KMFDM. He was on Extort and Nihil and all of those. But I didn't know him by name. I just knew the voice. And then when I purchased Sensation and listened to it, I heard Raymond Watts' voice. I was hooked. So I, like you with Nine Inch Nails, went out and bought all the Pig CDs I could find. I was in contact with his agent that was over in Japan who sold his stuff that you couldn't find over here.
Cool.
And I was getting it imported. I was going crazy with it. So that was my path.
Sweet. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Pig too, so I really like their stuff. We're not playing a track from it on the show because I wasn't sure, but Raymond Watts, who is Pig, actually wrote part of the soundtrack for MDK 2 as well. But there aren't any liner notes, so I don't know who wrote which song, because Jesper Kid also wrote music for that soundtrack as well, and his early stuff is very industrial, so I couldn't make heads or tails of which composer did which track. We do have a Jesper Kid track coming up, but not from that game. So anyways, Pig is another one to look out for. But speaking of KMFDM, let's take a listen to a track from the Spider-Man 2 soundtrack. This one is called Hung Like a Spider.
Wow, that was really good. That's my kind of industrial music right there. That was Spider-Man 2, Hung Like a Spider. I'm not sure how I feel about the name of the song. Is that like some kind of an insult or something?
I think it's a double entendre.
Or
because Spider-Man does hung right. Like a spider from a web, something like that.
Okay, well, we'll go with that then.
Anyhow, that game came out on the PS2, the GameCube, and the Xbox in 2004, composed by the members of KMFDM, and Michael McQuiston and Dynamic Music Partners also worked on that soundtrack. And McQuiston basically did like the cinematic orchestral elements of the soundtrack that would appear during the cutscenes, and then KMFDM wrote all the really aggressive dance kind of stuff that you would hear during boss battles and just regular enemy fights and stuff like that. So this is kind of what we're talking about. Very dancey beat, chuggy guitar. It's like halfway between metal and dance. Like you can't really peg it in one or the other. Two sets of instruments that don't normally collide, kind of colliding and making really good tunes.
Right, and lay some really aggressive, pissed-off lyrics on top of that, and you have industrial.
Exactly. So yeah, any of KMFDM's albums, like Extort or Nihil that we were talking about.
This is right in there.
Exactly.
With those, when KMFDM was arguably in its heyday, and those, what I would think would be people's favorite albums of theirs, this sort of is right in tune with that.
This is kind of like, 2002 is a little bit beyond where I came in. I think I started listening to them around 96, 97, somewhere around there. I think I was senior year high school. So, yeah, right around there is where I kind of...
You're dating us.
I know, I'm old. Anyways, KMFDM was mainly helmed at this point by Sasha Konietzko and N. Esch, and both of them were multi-instrumentalists, so drums, guitar, vocals, they did a whole bunch of stuff. KMFDM's kind of like almost an industrial super group of sorts. They have kind of like a rotating cast of people that come in and out for every one of their albums, so you would find people from all different bands on every single one of their albums, sometimes as guests for one track or another, sometimes they'd appear, on every song on the whole album. For a while they had Tim Skold, who later went on to be in Marilyn Manson. For a while they had some female vocalists and male vocalists, and just everything and anything from industrial. They were like, come on in, make some music with us. We really don't care. I think the band kind of went downhill once N. Esch left, because he was a really good guitarist, and these are the kinds of guitar riffs that were just so catchy and hooky and just kind of gave KMFDM that kind of a sound. And then once he left, I just didn't ever feel like they had the same kind of...
It changed. It was still good, but it didn't have that. Yeah. Whatever that is in this context, it didn't have it anymore.
Yeah.
And it was still good. I still purchased many of their albums and listened to them even now. But it was those Extort and Nihil and the albums of that era, I'll say, of KMFDM that were really the best, in my opinion.
Yeah, and they were influential on so many other industrial bands that came out in the future, too, and we'll talk about some of them as we go through the show. So let's move on to our next track. This one is one of Todd's picks. This is the title theme from RoboCop on the Game Boy. And welcome back. That was RoboCop, the Game Boy Color version, and that was the title screen by Oh God, you're going to make me do this. Krzysztof Wiecznikiewicz. Polish names are very difficult.
Better you than me trying to pronounce
Forgive me if I mess that one up.
This is so good. I have never played the Game Boy or Game Boy Color version of RoboCop. I played the NES version, but not this. I listen to this soundtrack all the time because it's so good. This track, I really love that bass line. Such a great, just solid groove. I can really see. I know they're not, not an industrial band, but I could see like Korn with their sort of detuned bass guitars.
Oh yeah,
just destroying this track.
Yeah, very bass-led
like
track. I love how like every 16 measures or so, like that white noise like comes. It's like a steam valve getting let off or something like that. It's really, really cool sounding. The track itself doesn't really like go many places, but that's okay. I mean, for me, I've said before on the show, like I like repeating patterns as long as they sound good. It doesn't need to go off into a crazy solo or be harmonizing with 10 different octaves or whatever. It's just something that you can, and this is a title screen song, so it's not like you're going to be sitting on it for a long time anyway. But I just like how the bass line and the keyboards kind of come together. There's a very like plodding, very heavy beat, and then again that kind of noise channel that kind of pops up every once in a while. It all just combines for like a very cool little tune.
Yeah, simple but awesome to listen to.
Yeah. So the composer, he's actually worked on tons of stuff. We might have played a track from him in the past, I don't remember. He's been working on stuff since 1994. A game called Rockstar Never Trust Rotten Tangerines. I don't know. In 2001, the Game Boy Color game came out. He did the music for that. And then he kind of started working on the Witcher series. So The Witcher, Witcher Enhanced Edition, Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings, and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. He composed a lot of the music and then did the original Witcher theme for Witcher 3. A couple other games like Bulletstorm, Spooky Runes, Runes of Avalon 2, Pony World. So like lots of really kind of varied games in terms of like moods go, because The Witcher and Pony World are kind of worlds apart, so it'd be interesting to see what those two soundtracks sounded like. But he started off on the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, and his music sounds very Western. It doesn't sound very Japanese at all.
No.
What do you say we move on to our next track?
Let's do it.
All right, this one is from a game that is extremely obscure. It's from a Quake Total conversion called X-Men: The Ravages of Apocalypse. And this came out for PC only in 1997, and this is from Method of the Worm.
You scared, frightened rabbits, you. You're sick people.
And we're back. That was a track from X-Men, The Ravages of Apocalypse for the PC in 1997. That was Tragic Rabbit by Method of the Worm.
Where do you even find this stuff?
Dude, this was a total coincidence, actually. Because I had Quake. I love Quake. I didn't have the internet back then, or very limited access to the internet. And so total conversions and mods and stuff, I was really into that stuff, but I had no way to get them. So I was wandering around CompUSA one day in the game section, and I found this game, which was a retail total conversion for Quake. And I was like, cool. It's got the X-Men in it. Pictures on the back looked cool. It's like $12, $13.
Why not?
So I brought it home. You know, the game was good. I didn't remember too much about it. You're fighting like clones of the X-Men. Like Wolverine keeps appearing like a billion times and you gotta shoot him. It was well done as far as the total conversion was done, and there were like cool comic panels in between the stages, which was cool because Quake didn't do anything like that. But what really got me was this soundtrack, and like I was totally into, like, at the height of my industrial fandom at that point, and these tracks just blew me away because this is like industrial. Like, you can't peg this as like a dance song or a rock song, or this is like pure, what I would call pure industrial music.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, you know, it doesn't have quite the chuggy guitarness that I, not that I don't like this, but it's not my particular style of industrial music, if you want to further cut industrial into more subsections. But it was really good. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, I've always kind of considered industrial music like a brand. Like, you can say, like, if you're talking about like cars,
like a mindset.
No, more like a product. Like, if you were talking about like cars, you could say I like Honda, which, you know, you can like the Civic and the Accord and the CR-V and all these other cars under the Honda umbrella, but you might not like their minivan version. So you can say you like industrial music, and you can like industrial rock and industrial dance and this and that and the other, but there are certain types like the really heavy industrial metal. Like, I'm not a big fan of that. Like, just because you say you like industrial doesn't mean you have to like
all industrial,
all the tendrils underneath that big
right.
Cthulhu industrial thing. This gets really noisy towards the end, so I understand that, you know, probably a lot of people might get a little turned off by that. For me, this is the kind of stuff I like live and die for.
Right.
This was just out of this world. But I think by the time I ended up getting the real internet at home, I searched for Method of the Worm on the web, and like all traces of it were gone. There was like, I could use like the Wayback Machine and see like remnants of like a site that may or may not have been part of it, but I couldn't find anything at all. And so like 15 years later or something, like very recently, because I was doing research for this show and I definitely wanted to put a track from this CD on the show, I was like, what the hell, I'll just search it again. Maybe somebody out there on a bulletin board somewhere remembers them and somebody I can talk about with it. And there was an actual website dedicated to Method of the Worm. I was like, what the hell, that just popped up out of nowhere. So I took a look at it, and so it's www.grimworks.com. And so I got to find out all about the guy behind the music, and his name is Gary Schaefer. He actually lives right here in this good old state of Connecticut where we're recording from. And so he's done a lot of multimedia stuff. He's actually worked with Marvel to do like electronic or e-comics, like interactive comics and stuff. So I think a lot of that stuff that was on the Ravages of Apocalypse disc, like he was responsible for that, as well as like making the music for it. He's done design work for the Toys R Us, that huge Toys R Us billboard that's in Times Square. Like, he designed the graphics and like the interactivity of that stuff. So he's done a lot of really cool things. He recently, just last year, put out a full album under the Method of the Worm name. So if you just search for Method of the Worm on Google, it'll take you to like several pages where you can go out and buy it. And the music is very similar to this. He's matured a lot since these tracks, so I think they're a little less noisy and a little more melodic and a little more vocal oriented, but they're really good stuff. I actually kind of chatted with Gary a little bit on Facebook, and he sent me a link to the album, so I checked it out, and it's definitely worth picking up. So we can share some samples of that on our Facebook group as well. And you know, if you look at his page on Grimworks, you know, he cites bands like Skinny Puppy as his influences, and I can definitely see that in this track because it sounds very, very similar to their work.
Yeah, it definitely does.
So let's move on to the song that you've been waiting for this entire show. This is the opening theme from Quake by the man, Trent Reznor himself.
I'm so excited.
Let's hit it.
Welcome back. That was opening theme from the game Quake on PC, released in 1996 by the absolutely incredible Trent Reznor.
Mr. Nine Inch Nails himself.
Mr. Nails.
It's so nice to be able to share a track from him on this show, because
it really is.
I'm just such a huge fan. So,
and this track, a lot of these tracks that we're playing and that we will play sound a lot like video game music. They have that industrial feel. They've got the chuggy guitars or the bass riffs or whatever, but they sound like they were made for a video game. And this track, at least to me, sounds like it came off of the cutting room floor of Downward Spiral.
Yeah.
Like you could actually take this track, save for the ambient stuff at the end, but stick it right in the middle of Downward Spiral and it'll fit right in.
Totally.
It's so emblematic of what Trent was doing at the time that it just sounds like more Nine Inch Nails, which, works for me.
And it worked with the ambience of the game itself very well, too. You look at Quake and you can imagine music like this playing in the background. So it's not like it was just like, oh, I wrote this for Downward Spiral, I'm just going to throw this in the game, and it doesn't really fit very well. Everything just blended. So I guess the way this partnership started was that Trent Reznor was on tour with Nine Inch Nails, promoting, I think, the Broken EP that they had just put out. And word got out that, like, instead of, like, partying and, like, doing all the stuff that rock stars usually do, you could always find him on his bus playing Doom, like, after every show and in between, like, driving from place to place. And I guess word got out to id Software and John Carmack that he was a really big fan of the game. So John Carmack approached Trent and was like, well, would you consider doing some music for this new game that we've got coming out? So Trent just said, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to be a part of it. So that's how that whole partnership came into play. And it's really, I guess they stayed friends. I guess they still chat every once in a while,
Makes
too.
sense.
So this soundtrack, I think, kind of felt a little bit let down by it when it first came out, because I was expecting energetic industrial rock to be shooting hordes of monsters to, and it really ended up being a lot of more ambient soundscapes with kind of like sprinkled in guitar and drum riffs here and there. I don't know, did you feel the same way about it when you heard it, or?
Yeah, you're right. There's times when it sort of picks up, but it is a lot of ambient stuff. But that's kind of what Doom has a lot of the hard hitting tracks. So
yeah,
maybe less of that. I don't know. It must have just been a conversation between Trent and ID that
thanks, Mike.
that they had on how they wanted the game to feel in terms of the soundtrack. So, but that opening track really set you up for what you were into with Quake. I always liked Doom a little bit better than Quake. That was just my opinion at the time. I didn't dislike Quake. I'm not a big first-person shooter fan in general. Quake is really the last first-person shooter I've played for any reasonable length of time. I actually didn't know that Trent had made this soundtrack when I started playing Quake, because I, being 15 or 16 years old at the time, didn't have a lot of money, so buying a game legitimately wasn't a thing that I could do a lot of, and so I had a burned copy of it.
Dun, dun, dun. I think the first thing I did when I bought this game was I went home and threw it in my CD player. I didn't even bother installing the game to play it. I was more in it for the soundtrack than I was the actual game itself. Because, like I said last episode, I wasn't really a big Doom fan. I didn't play it that much. So I was not particularly in it for the game itself. And so, threw the CD in, this song plays, and I'm like, this is awesome. And then it was 3 minutes of, like, this droning keyboard synth, and I was like, well, this is kind of interesting. So we skipped to the next track, and it was, like, a little bit more of the same, maybe a little bit more of a rhythm, but I was like, because it had been already so long since Nine Inch Nails had come out with any music, I wanted something that I could listen to as a new Nine Inch Nails album. That's kind of what I was expecting. So when I listened to it by itself on a CD player, I was like, well, okay,
yeah, that makes sense.
And now, looking back on it, and now that Nine Inch Nails they put out an album called Ghosts 1 through 4, which was full of instrumental and ambient soundscapes. Listening to that and learning to appreciate that made me able to go back to the Quake soundtrack and recognize it for what it really is. And the Ghosts was almost kind of an extension of the Quake soundtrack, if you think about it, because they're very, very similar pieces of music. Instrumental, ambient, takes you to different places if you close your eyes, kind of a deal. So I was able to listen to the Quake soundtrack and kind of understand where he was coming from when he made it. So
also the movie soundtracks that he's done recently.
Oh, yeah.
Too. is that same sort of ambient, but very much Trent Reznor.
And so yeah, it was Social Network and
Gone
Girl, and they've won Grammys for it.
Yeah.
So he's gone from
Trent Reznor in a suit.
I know,
not something I ever thought I'd see. At least not done ironically.
I saw a meme on the internet not too long ago, and it was like a two pictures, like one on the top and one on the bottom, and the first one was Trent Reznor from like his early days with like the dreads and like the shirt with the arms torn off it, and he's like, at first I was like, F the establishment, and then on the bottom there was another picture of him in a suit with a Grammy, and he's like kind of shrugging, and then the text says, but then I was like,
yeah. Well,
it's really funny.
Opinions change when you get older, I guess.
Yeah, well, he's got kids to feed, so
that's right.
He's doing what he needs to do, and he's still making excellent music, so I'm not complaining about that.
He's supposed to come out with another album this year, so he says.
Yeah.
I'm waiting impatiently.
Absolutely. So, all right, let's get retro for a little bit. We're going back to 1993 on the SNES. This is a twofer. We're going to do the introduction track and the Maria Mercurial theme from Shadowrun. And we're back. That was Shadowrun, the SNES version. Came out in 1993. That was the introductory track, and Maria Mercurial Redux by Marshall Parker.
When you asked me to be on this show and asked me to pick out some tracks, I was struggling to find tracks that had that sort of industrial feel that we've been talking about so far this whole show, but were chippy. I like chippy video game music more than the more recent, like, actual live band type of stuff.
Yeah.
That's sort of the quintessential, like, video game, style for me. So I was struggling to find games that had that style of music, but were also chiptunes and not, just industrial tracks that were in a video game. And Shadowrun, I remembered, is like that sort of dystopian future, cyberpunk kind of game. I haven't played it, since, I was maybe 20 or something, but I remember that it was that style, and I said, maybe this soundtrack has something. So that intro track, once it actually kicks in, is really, really good. I like that, that groove that it picks up on. But it ends so quickly. I really wish it continued on, even if it just played for a little bit longer.
Yeah. The way it works is it kind of scans. It's almost like a cinematic. It pans over the city while the music is playing. I think there's some scroll text. And then once the game's logo pops up on the title screen, it's like, boom, and it just kind of ends right then and there. So, but yeah, the game itself, I used to own, and I still do own, actually. But I've played through it many, many times. I really like this game. It's a real-time action RPG. It's kind of simple, but it does follow the rules of the Shadowrun tabletop game. And it takes place in Seattle, grungiest of all places. And it's good stuff. I like the Maria Mercurial theme. It's not so much industrial as I think it is more like a goth rock kind of a song, like The Cure, Sisters of Mercy, Susie and the Banshees, that kind of stuff.
Marilyn Manson.
Marilyn Manson's more like gross rock.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't call Marilyn Manson really goth. A lot of the older like Irish and Scottish bands from like the late 80s, early 90s have that kind of a feel to it, where it's got kind of a Celtic guitar, kind of weepy, very deep vocals. Like that's what goth rock mainly is. I listened to some of that. They're kind of industrial and goth are kind of like intertwined with each other in a way. Goth rock came more from like punk. Like the Misfits were kind of like bridging that gap between punk and goth. So I wasn't really as much into it as I was industrial, but this track, the Maria Mercurial track, plays in kind of a goth punk club inside the game. And so she's on stage with a band, and you can see the band performing this song. So while the song itself might not sound too much like it, just the environment that it's in kind of makes it feel like it's more of a like a goth song to me.
That makes sense. I never really got into the goth thing. My mother is very appreciative that I never did the black eyeliner, black dye my hair black thing. Black. So I never did that.
Yeah.
I listened to, obviously the music that we're talking about now, but I didn't dress the part as much.
I kind of did. I was mainly like chains, ripped jeans, black t-shirts. And then when I would go out, like to the goth clubs, like I went to like two goth clubs per week, I think we did, downtown in the city. Then I would do like the eyeliner and the fishnet shirts.
I did wear Genkos, so maybe I kind of did sort of edge into it a little bit.
Genkos? Oh, the really baggy
big
pants?
Yeah. Which oddly enough are making a comeback, believe it or not.
Yeah. See, what the scene that I was in, we didn't really do those Jinko jeans. It was more like, because that was more like raver stuff. So we were like cargo pants or really like tight, like stonewashed or black jeans that had just been washed so much that they were gray.
Yeah.
Like more on the punk side, I guess.
Right.
But yeah, so I would do that stuff and listen to music like this and annoy my parents. It was fun.
Because no one understands me.
No one understood me, man. Grunge didn't work for me, so I had to go be a rivet head or a goth kid. It was fun. Yep. All right, so let's move on to a track from a band or one-man band kind of guy that we are also both very big fans of. This one coming up is from the new Killer Instinct game. This is Rash's theme from Cell Dweller. And we're back. That was the theme from Rash of the Battletoads for the new Killer Instinct game, and that was from Cell Dweller. And yeah, it's a really good combination of the old and the new. I really like the way he integrated the Battletoads themes into his like traditional kind of industrial rock music.
That homage to the pause theme.
Isn't that cool near the end?
Super awesome, yeah.
And he kind of turns it into like a punk kind of a deal there,
Right.
too. It's very staccato, very, very fun to listen to.
Right, he sort of plays just the pause theme for a few seconds there, just like a couple of iterations of it, and then mixes it into what you're talking about. You can still tell it's there, but if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't hear it. So
Yeah.
he makes sure that you hear it.
Oh, yeah. And it shows that he knows enough about the game itself to know that pause theme is kind of...
Iconic.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like, if you're going to do a Battletoads homage, you do the pause theme.
Yes. You will be flamed forever if you do not. So let's talk a little bit about Cell Dweller, because it was kind of what you and I bonded over, I guess, when we were talking about games and music. Because we had a mutual friend, and I moved into an apartment complex with my fiancée, and it just happened to be the same apartment complex that you lived in, and it wasn't a very big complex to begin with. So our mutual friend Jay came over, and you guys came over, and I think one of the first things you noticed was a signed Cell Dweller poster on my wall, and you were like, oh my god, you know about Cell Dweller?
I had no idea that somebody besides me even knew about Cell
I was
Dweller.
the same way.
So when I saw that, I said, so video games, Cell Dweller, all right.
Yep. And 15 years later, the friendship is still going, so... Well, maybe not 15. It's more like 10 years later.
It's probably about 15 years now.
Well, let's see. I'm thinking my wife was pregnant with Eddie, and he's 10 now, so it's about a decade.
All right.
About an even decade.
Maybe 11 or 12.
Yeah. Anyhow, so yeah, it was pretty cool just bumping into somebody that had extremely similar tastes in both music and video games. As you can tell, it kind of culminates in this whole podcast. So after this, I'm just never going to talk to you again.
Okay. Well,
That works.
It's been fun, but
Just a big build up to a show. So Cell Dweller is the latest project of a man known only as Clayton with a K. And Todd, I guess you knew about him before I did, because he had a really old band called Argyle Park. How did you originally start learning about him?
I literally, in my thirst for things Nine Inch Nails like, was searching the internet for bands that sound like Nine Inch Nails. And I came across this group that called themselves Argyle Park. They're from Long Island, New York. And they had released, at the time, one album called Misguided. And it's just got that sound. It just has that angsty, sort of techno-y, but guitar-driven, really nice sound that I had been looking for. It really resonated with what I was interested in at the time, and still is. It's Misguided remains one of my favorite albums of all time. As well as Argyle Park, he did his own, Clayton that is, did his own solo stuff called Circle of Dust. He also had another solo act long before that. I forget what it's called, but it only released one like cassette tape, like 4 songs on it. So that's how old that was. And then he moved on to what he's currently doing called Cell Dweller. He released a self-titled album, but that's around the time I started losing interest in him. He sort of technoed up his music a lot more, polished it a little bit more than I like. His sound changed beyond my very focused little narrow view of interest in what he's doing.
Yeah, it kind of at that point started actually growing into more like what I listened to. So.
Right. So that's around the time you picked it up.
Yeah, exactly. I learned about him when his last Circle of Dust album came out called Disengage. I just happened to pick it up randomly and really fell in love with it, and went to the URL that was on the back of the CD case, and same kind of thing that happened with Method of the Worm. There was very little information because he was transitioning from Circle of Dust into Cell Dweller, so it was more like this is the old Circle of Dust page, be on the lookout for Cell Dweller, it's a new project. And then the page was down for like, I don't know, a couple years almost. It seemed like it to me anyway. And he's like, I've got this new band coming, it's going to be awesome, you're not going to believe it when you hear it. And so I just kept kind of refreshing this page, like going back to it once every other week or so just to see what was going on. And then he started building it up again and then releasing more music. And I was like, whoa, this stuff is really good. So I got some of the demos and really enjoyed it. And then the album came out and it was phenomenal. And now he's pretty much blown up. I mean, he's got so many releases under his belt. He's got his own record label called Fixed. He's been doing music for TV and commercials and movies. He did some of the soundtrack for Dead Rising 3 and the Dead Rising Zero, that kind of introductory game that came out right before Dead Rising 3. So a lot of cool stuff is going on. He and Atlas Plug are now doing the soundtrack for Season 3 of Killer Instinct, so they're taking a whole bunch of the Killer Instinct characters' original themes from the SNES and arcade and N64 versions and kind of remixing them like they did with the Battletoads theme here. And he's just got a really polished sound that, like we've said before, kind of sits somewhere between electronic and rock or metal, and it just fits very well with action games, I think. And he knows how to compose music for both rock style albums and for movies and for games. He's got it kind of all going on. He's just a really talented dude. His sound in general, you hear those very kind of like rounded sounding guitars. Like you hear that a lot in his albums with those very thick drums, and then every once in a while you get these kind of like influxes of glitchy electronics and techno. He's been kind of getting into dubstep a little bit, so he released an album, like his second to last album, had a lot of dubstep influences.
That's kind of the path he's been taking, though.
Yeah,
he went from this very sort of, I'll say, basic music. That's really for lack of a better term, but a lot simpler, dirty, gritty guitars and kind of noisy, just noise that he sort of collaborated together into something that sounded good in like Cell Dweller and whatnot, and has moved more into very polished, very heavily produced, perfected, I guess I can say.
Yeah.
Kind of the same thing, but just, polished.
Absolutely. If you watch TV, if you've seen movie trailers, there's a very good chance that you've heard his music in something, because it's actually all over the place now. So do yourself a favor and check him out. You can just go to celldweller.com or his label fixed.com. And if you like this kind of music, his record label also has tons of bands that are very similar to him as well.
Yeah, he's kind of amassed this whole sort of, I guess, community of artists and fans of this style of music that they're all doing.
Yeah, he released a series of CDs called Soundtrack for the Voices in My Head, and they were instrumental songs. They were pretty much built so that he could put his stuff out there and say, hey, movie companies, hey, TV companies, hey, video game companies, take a listen to what I can do with these soundscapes I can create.
So like a calling card.
Exactly, and he had a licensing model for these songs that was extremely cheap. So people could listen to these songs, get in contact with him, and he would be like, yeah, for this low price of whatever dollars, instead of, chopping a zero off the end of the normal guy's price. Put it in your commercial, put it in your trailer, do whatever you want with it. And that's how his name started to get known. So he kind of like lost himself a bit of money so that he could get his name out there. And he's smart. He did it well. And so his stuff is starting to pop up all over the place now. So, it's kind of culminating in these big name, rare developed titles. He's a multi-instrumentalist, so he plays drums, he plays guitar, he plays keyboard, he masters the albums, like he does everything by himself.
Sound familiar?
Which makes all this even more impressive. Yeah, Trent Reznor does a very similar thing. Trent Reznor collaborates even more than Clayton does, though. Clayton, like one or two guys maybe, will join him for a couple of songs on an album or something, but the rest of it's just like purely him. And so I think, he's going to do what he wants. So he's not necessarily always going to go to where the money is. He's going to wake up one morning and say, let's put out an album, and then for the next 3 years we'll work on that album. I don't think things are going to deter him one way or the other from doing that. So anyways, yeah, that was a fantastic song. It goes on for like 7 minutes, but it really never gets tiring. It just constantly changes and morphs and incorporates different versions of the Battletoads soundtrack. So I really like the way he handled this one. He just recently came out with a remix of Idol's theme for Killer Instinct as well, and so every time a new character is introduced for the new season of Killer Instinct, he puts out a trailer with the theme for that character. So it's almost like a song release as well as a character release, which is kind of neat. All right, let's move into our next track. Speaking of Dead Rising 3, this one is from Dead Rising 3. This is the Hemlock Melee Battle from Sasha Dikasian, otherwise known as Sonic Mayhem. All right, that was Hemlock Melee Battle from Sasha Dikisian, otherwise known as Sonic Mayhem, also from the Dead Rising 3 soundtrack. Came out in 2013. Kind of a noisy, gritty, beat-driven monstrosity. Perfect for smashing zombie heads in.
I have a solidly neutral opinion on this track.
Yeah?
No, it was fine. Not great. Not terrible.
Yeah.
Right solidly in the middle.
It's good as background music for the kind of game that you're playing.
Yeah. Having never played the game, then I guess that.
Yeah, sitting alone, I guess, maybe that doesn't really have as much melody as one would kind of want from a song like this. You know, you kind of hear those kind of orchestral keyboards coming out in the background a little bit, but they just do a couple of chords and then just drop back out. It's not like they really have any sort of a musical line that you can kind of hum or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not something that you can really sort of groove to. Or that I would want to put on, like, you know, in my car or something like that.
Yeah.
What'd you think, Mike? All right.
I didn't like it at all. Shut up, Steve. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to throw this one in because I am a big fan of Sonic Mayhem ever since their kind of brutal industrial guitar soundtrack from Quake 2, which I played a few episodes ago. And he's done some stuff. You know, he's probably most popular nowadays for doing the Mass Effect 3 soundtrack, but that was more cinematic sounding, a little more orchestral sounding, and this is very, very industrial. You know, just things smashing against each other in a pattern. That's pretty much what you can call this one.
You're right.
So that's, you know, one of those kind of almost kind of a genre in industrial in and of itself, like industrial noise, like Mentallo and the Fixer. Some of the earliest Skinny Puppy stuff are just very. There's no melody. It's just noise. Really aggressive rhythm and noise.
Yeah.
And I like it to an extent. There's a band out there called Einstürzende Neubauten, obviously German, but they make their own instruments out of industrial equipment, pipes and saw blades and Dremels and whatever, and they figure out ways to make tones and harmonies and stuff out of them, and it kind of ends up sounding much like this. So there you go. Anyhow, Dead Rising 3 is a lot of fun. It's kind of a hack and slash zombie killing kind of game where you can put weapons together and you just use them to bash the hell out of enemies. All the bosses in the game are patterned after the 7 deadly sins, so that's why Lust Battle is called Lust Battle, because that's the one that represents lust. And there's Envy and Sloth and all the other ones, and they have different sounds that go along with them. So that is that. Let's move on. We're going to get a little retro again. This one, like I said before at the beginning of the show, a lot of Jesper Kid's earlier stuff was very industrial sounding, especially the stuff he wrote for the Genesis and Mega Drive. This is one of his most popular soundtracks from that period, The Adventures of Batman and Robin. This is Gotham by Night. Howdy! That was the Adventures of Batman and Robin on the Sega Genesis, released in 1995. The track was called Gotham by Night from level 1 of the game by Jesper Kid.
If you didn't tell me that was on the Genesis, I never would have known it.
Crazy, isn't it?
I'm going to piss off a lot of Genesis purists, but I'm not a big fan of the sound chip on the Genesis. It just sounds like dirty, like fuzzy.
Some people like it because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I get it, but I grew up playing SNES, so the sound of the SNES rings true for me. I didn't have a Genesis until fairly recently, so I didn't grow up listening to it. It didn't resonate with me, and still kind of doesn't. But this doesn't sound like it came off of that chip to me.
Yeah, no. Most of Jesper Kid's soundtracks from the Genesis sound very much like this. They're very. It's a kind of an offshoot genre of industrial music called EBM, electronic body music, and bands like Covenant, Assemblage 23, Front 242. They write music like this. So it's very kind of like a slower dance music, much heavier than your normal kind of regular dance floor music would be, but very aggressive and thick synths, lots of heavy beats. Most of Jesper Kid's songs on all of his Genesis soundtracks will go on for 6 minutes without repeating. They're insane. But he'll take different patterns and different parts and kind of mix and match them together, so you're not really always hearing new pieces in that 6 minutes. You're hearing different combinations of pieces that he's put out, throughout the entire song into one. So, and it sounds cool, and that's kind of what a lot of these EBM bands do as well. They're like sonic soundscapes that they kind of experiment with and throw lots of different things together.
Right. Well, I'll have to check out more of his stuff.
Yeah, he's done a lot of stuff. He did Adventures of Batman and Robin, Subterranea, AWS Pro Moves Soccer. The soccer game's actually a little more upbeat than the other ones that he's done, but Adventures of Batman and Robin is probably considered one of his best soundtracks on the Genesis. Nowadays, he's writing music for Assassin's Creed and Borderlands and a lot of those big AAA titles.
I kind of find it hard to imagine an industrial soundtrack over a soccer game.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't play during the game. It's just mostly, there's only 3 pieces of music, 3 or 4 pieces of music, and it's menu, title screen, victory and loss or something.
Even that,
like
it doesn't.
That.
Industrial doesn't say
Doesn't really lend
soccer
itself.
to me.
Yeah, no, I know. But like I said, it's a little more upbeat than some of the other stuff that you'll find. It has more of a regular kind of a dance music sound to it. All right, let's move on. This is a game called Air Mech. This came out on the PS4, PC, Xbox One, and Xbox 360 in 2012. The track is called Burning Skyline from Frontline Assembly.
Welcome back. That was Air Mech, released on PS4, PC, Xbox One, and Xbox 360. Must have been right in that transitional phase.
Yeah.
Back in 2012, the name of the track was Burning Skyline, and it was done by Frontline Assembly. This was good.
I like it too.
Okay, and moving on. It kind of went on. I really liked when it kicked in after maybe, 45 seconds, a minute or so, when the song really picked up. That bass line made me really wish I had my system in my car still.
Yeah, really nice thick bass tones in this one. Kind of a little bit of a dubstep influence with that womp, womp, womp. Kind of like there's a few wubs here and there.
A little bit of wub.
But it kind of accentuates the track instead of is the focus of the track.
Right. Very listenable, if that makes any sense.
Exactly. And Frontline Assembly started out, like, I think back in '86 or way back then. They were very aggressive, and as time went on, they've kind of swung back and forth between being very kind of like noisy to having a lot of like really heavy guitar as their lead instrument to kind of going more ambient and listenable, kind of like this again, and then back to heavy. Like they've swung back and forth simply because there have been so many different lineups in the band. And they've also got a side project called Delirium, which, while kind of industrial, is also very like more ambient and almost like easy listening electronic music if you want to go that far. So I think some of that had a lot of influence on this song as well, because you get those really sweeping synth lines and they almost sound like violins. And then, kind of goes back and forth between being heavy and light again.
Right.
The game itself is a strategy game. It's not like an action strategy game. This kind of music kind of fits that because you're going to be in one area for a good maybe 10, 15 minutes sometimes. So having kind of a more melodic, listenable track like this, I think will help rather than like screaming guitars going 90 miles an hour. This whole soundtrack, Frontline Assembly wrote all the music for. Previously in video game land, they wrote half of the soundtrack for Quake 3 Arena, but that soundtrack was way more aggressive, and it was like super noisy industrial stuff, which was almost too aggressive for me. Like it was really out there. This album I find has a lot more mature in its tastes, I think. There's been a good half a decade to a decade between those two games anyway, and I think Frontline Assembly as a band has kind of grown up a lot as they've gone on. I guess the main member of Frontline Assembly, his name is Bill Lieb. He's been there since the beginning. When I started finding out about the band, like there was a record store in my hometown called Exile on Main Street, and they were like this independent record shop. They had a dedicated industrial music section, which made it so easy for me to find new stuff. So most of these bands, I would just walk into the record store, be like, hey guys, because I knew them on a first name basis at that point. Like once a week whenever I got paid, I would just go in there and buy a couple CDs. And so, they would tell me about new stuff that showed up, and one day one of the new Frontline Assembly albums was in the bin, and I was like, oh, this looks cool. That's the same way I found out about Clayton, because Circle of Dust was just sitting in that bin, and I was like, oh, all right, may as well check this out. The cover looks cool. Never heard them, never read an article about a review on them. I was like, literally, this looks like a good cover. Let's go check it out. So I think the first album I bought from Frontline Assembly was called Millennium. And it was like heavy industrial beats. And then they also had guitars from Devin Townsend. So it was like super duper thick, crunchy guitars, industrial beats, gravelly vocals. It was really good stuff. And then every single album they came out with after that, it was like a new treat. It was always good, but it always sounded completely different from their last album. So they're a band where if you don't particularly like something they've come out with, just try a different album and maybe it'll be more to your tastes, because they've always got something cool going on. And like I said, Air Mech, they released an album called Air Mech, which is basically the soundtrack of the album, and there's a good dozen or so pieces on there that range anywhere from super noisy to more easily listenable like this one, and I love the whole thing. All right, well, let's move on to something a little more guitar-driven and a little more heavy. This one is called Now You've Really Crossed the Line from Devil May Cry 3 from 2005. This one's from Tetsuya Shibata and Sean McPherson.
Now
And we're back. That was Devil May Cry 3, released on the PS2 in 2005. The track was called Now You've Really Crossed the Line, from Tetsuya Shibata and Sean McPherson.
I don't think you have the voice anymore.
No, I know.
You're not
I'm a little gravelly.
anymore, but
What'd you think?
it was good. It was. It reminds me a lot of. I actually just added it to our list here of a band called Bile, which is super heavy, super loud, sort of the extreme end of the industrial spectrum.
Yeah,
the extreme,
kind of along with like Suicide Commando and Alien Sex Fiend and
sure.
Yeah, they're all the same. You don't know of them, but yeah,
it reminded me a lot of that. Just that sort of really kind of gravelly voiced vocals with the low, heavy guitars.
Yeah,
mixed in with a little bit of dancey synth mixed in for good measure.
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything.
Bile doesn't have so much of the dancey stuff. It's got more of the
chuggy,
heavy guitars.
Yeah. Sean McPherson also goes by the name Shooty HG. He's the lead singer of the band Hostile Groove, and their music is a little more metal than like this. This is obviously a more industrial sounding track. Now, I'm not exactly sure how the composition went with this game, because I know Tetsuya Shibata wrote the music for most of the game, but the music in the game sounds it's either orchestral or it's like very ambient, like when you're walking around inside the castles or grounds or wherever you are, the music is very mellow, it's almost non-existent. And then whenever enemies show up, the gates come up and you can't go any farther until you beat 5 or 6 guys. That's when this music would kind of come up out of nowhere. And then it would play until you beat the enemies, and then it would fade back down into the ambient stuff again. So I'm not sure how much Sean McPherson had in terms of composition, or if he's just credited for vocals, so I'm assuming that maybe Shibata wrote the music for this track, and then Sean McPherson wrote the lyrics and sang them, so I don't exactly know how that went. It works out pretty well, though. I like the soundtracks in these games have always been like that. It's always been a huge dichotomy between very mellow ambient tracks for the exploration parts, and then it just goes right into huge industrial growly metal songs for the battle scenes, it continued into Devil May Cry 4, and then the DMC, the reboot that they did, both industrial metal band Combat Christ and industrial noisy band Noisia, they wrote the soundtrack for that game as well. So they've kind of continued this industrial love affair throughout the Devil May Cry series.
All right, well, I've got new soundtracks to listen to.
Yeah, definitely worth checking out. Especially the Noisia stuff from DMC is really, really good. All right, let's move on to our next track. This is from Descent Maximum, or Descent 2, depending on the console you're talking about. This came out for the PSX and PC in 1997. This track is called Glut, from Kevin Ogilvy and Mark Walk. All right, we're back. That was Glut from the Descent Maximum or Descent 2 soundtrack, released in 1997 from Kevin Ogilvy and Mark Walk. And also other composers on this game were Brian Luzietti, Mark Morgan, Larry Peacock, Tim Wiles, Johan Langley, Ronald Valdez, and Leslie Spitzer. This particular track was Kevin Ogilvy and Mark Walk. Nowadays, the duo is known as Ogre, O-H-G-R. But when this track was recorded, Kevin Ogilvy was part of Skinny Puppy, still is, and Mark Walk was just kind of like a sometime collaborator on Skinny Puppy, but not a member of the band.
I never could get into Skinny Puppy. I kept hearing that Skinny Puppy was an industrial band. And so I went to the store and I picked up a little double album called Brap.
Oh, yeah.
And I tried. I really tried.
Okay.
And I just couldn't. So that was it for me.
Brap is like a collection of their really early demo tapes. It is like not indicative of what the band sounds like nowadays.
Well, I took a shot and missed, I guess.
I'll have to send you some good tracks, because I started up listening to them when the album called The Process came out, and that was, 96, somewhere around there. Like, the songs are much more structured, there's some guitar in there, it was a lot easier to listen to. Brap was like just them jamming out and recording it, and they just decided to release a double album. So yeah, not a good way to start off with the band. Anyhow, this particular track though, I mean, super duper noisy, not everybody's cup of tea, understandable.
I was wondering where it was going at first, and then when it hit that, I'll say chorus, the sort of
kind of like bass plus drums.
Yeah, it's sort of more even, I'll say, part of the song. That's when it really hit its groove for me. Yeah,
that's a really good part. A lot of the Ogre stuff sounds... Okay, so let's delineate here. Kevin Ogilvy is also known as Ogre, O-G-R-E, like the normal Ogre, which is his stage name when he performs with Skinny Puppy. Kevin Ogilvy plus Mark Walk is known as Ogre, O-H-G-R. So they're their own outfit that releases their own albums. They've got, I think, 3 or 4 albums out at this point. So... it's almost like you have to delineate which Ogre you're talking about when you're talking about Ogre. But most people will know Kevin Ogilvy as Ogre, O-G-R-E, the lead singer and member of Skinny Puppy. Anyways, huge fan of Skinny Puppy and of Ogre, the band that he has with Mark Walk. It's hard to explain the type of music that they are. A lot of it's noisy, a lot of it is more melodic. The lyrics are bizarre and rhymey and don't always seem to make a lot of sense, but you can kind of like pick through it and figure out the meanings. The music makes you think a lot, and if you can get around the fact that a lot of it is noise, and if you're not a big fan of noise, you can really kind of discover some really awesome music in there as well. I'll send you some good tracks, and I think you'll appreciate them. Anyway, so Descent Maximum was the PSX version of the Descent 2 game. I guess Maximum had like the best parts of Descent and Descent 2 kind of thrown together on the PlayStation. It was very similar to Quake in the sense that it was a very early 3D game where you're kind of roaming through levels, but the main draw behind Descent was that you had a full 360-degree range of movement. So these levels were in zero gravity. You were in a ship, and so you can move up, down, left, right, do barrel rolls, go crazy. There was momentum, but you could literally just stop and float in midair without being drawn to any particular surface. So there was no up, which made getting through the levels pretty difficult once they got a little more complicated. But,
right, I really loved Descent. That was such a great game. And I know it's, these days with computers and graphic processing being what it is, having a game where you can have 360-degree movement is, like every day.
Whatever,
whatever. But at the time, Descent was breaking new ground with doing that, being able to move up and down and left and right and turn and go in any given direction from where you are was not something seen before.
Yeah, so not only was it a novelty, but it was also a very good game in and of its own right. A lot of times, you'll see people come out with new technology and you'll have essentially like a tech demo or something that doesn't really work very well. It's impressive to look at, but Descent had really good enemies, very good control, a neat little storyline behind it, a very good soundtrack, not only including, the guys from Ogre, but there were a whole bunch of different artists on there that all they were kind of electronic, avant-garde kind of songs. I think I chose this specific track because Ogre is like one of the grandfathers of industrial music, and I would probably feel a lot of regret if I didn't include any music that he's done for video game music in some sort of capacity on this show. So yeah, Descent is totally worthwhile checking out. There have been some remakes. I don't know whether they've been fan remakes or like officially released remakes, but with upgraded graphics and more of a modern aesthetic to them.
Recently a game was released called Sublevel Zero, which very much has that reminiscent Descent 360-degree movement kind of feel, flying through caverns and whatnot. I haven't actually played it, even though it is in my Steam library, oddly enough, because that's an uncommon thing. But my understanding it is a sort of I hesitate to call it this, but roguelike Descent
procedurally
game.
generated levels.
Procedurally generated levels. Every game is different. You play until you die, and then you start over type of game. And I've seen footage of it. It looks really awesome. I hope to someday play it. We'll see.
That's really cool. I have to check that one out. All right, let's move on to our last track of the day. I couldn't do an industrial show without something from Silent Hill. I mean, obviously. This one's a little bit different, though, than the stuff we've been playing. So this is called Letter from the Lost Days. From Silent Hill 3, came out on the PS2 and Xbox in 2003, written by Akira Yamaoka, with vocals by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn. And we're back. That was our last track of the show from Silent Hill 3. It's called Letter from the Lost Days. Came out on the PS2 and Xbox in 2003, composed by Akira Yamaoka with vocals by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn. And that's like a whole different side of the industrial landscape. I don't really know if there are too many quote-unquote real industrial bands out there that do music like this. I don't know if you know of any, Todd.
This song, I don't know if you would agree, but this song sounds a lot like something I would hear off of a How to Destroy Angels album.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which, obviously, we're getting back to Trent Reznor, but for those who don't know, Trent Reznor got married fairly recently, and he and his wife did a side project called How to Destroy Angels. They released one album, went on a very brief tour before Trent released his most recent Nine Inch Nails album. And this song sounds very much like something I would expect to hear off of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can call How to Destroy Angels industrial necessarily. It's much more modern, ambient, sort of...
Ambient
electronic, noisy kind of stuff. I don't know if it fits that description.
It's hard to pigeonhole it. You know,
it really is.
A lot of Trent Slater stuff you really can't pigeonhole anyway, because he's been kind of genre bending since the early 90s. So it's tough to, people just kind of like peg him there, I guess, because that's what he was introduced as when, Broken got big and Downward Spiral got big. So now anything that he ever comes up with is going to be labeled industrial,
right.
But yeah, no, I definitely agree with you that the How to Destroy Angels, female-led vocalist, kind of a slower paced, very kind of sleepy, almost electronic background music.
Right.
So kind of like with the Silent Hill 3 and all the Silent Hill soundtracks for the most part, Akira Yamaoka wrote very creepy music, and a lot of it was very hard and very abrasive. But then you get songs like this that take place during, more emotional moments throughout the game, where it's very kind of a almost homesick feeling, like melancholy, but still has that kind of aggressive percussion and drum beat back there, and you still kind of have to call it industrial because it still just sounds like that.
Right. A while ago, you and I were talking about Silent Hill, and you convinced me to finally play it. I have never played it. So I went home and I dutifully purchased on PlayStation Network the original Silent Hill that was released on PlayStation. And I could not. It's unplayable. If you don't have
it hasn't
the
aged
nostalgic
well. You gotta start with Silent Hill 2 if you want to start in the series.
It's unplayable.
I don't know. Did I tell you to start with the first one, or did I? I thought I would have probably.
I don't know that you told me to
start
start with one. I think you sold me on the series, and I said, well, being who I am, the best thing to probably do would be to start at the beginning. That was a mistake.
Yeah, no, you don't need to play the first one to play the second one. And I think they released a remastered version of the second one for like the PS3. Anyway,
yeah, I picked it up.
So.
It's the second and third, I think, in a bundle.
Yeah.
On PS3.
Yeah, definitely
I just haven't played it.
Start with Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 3 kind of goes back a little bit to what Silent Hill 1 was about, but you don't need to have played the first game to really understand what's going on. So
well, that's good.
Give it another shot. All of the Silent Hill soundtracks are phenomenal. I have sought high and low to find both the American and Japanese versions of all of the Silent Hill soundtracks. Just fantastic stuff. Akira Yamaoka is one of my favorite composers. I have a feeling we're going to be doing an episode on Silent Hill in general when we get closer to Halloween. I'm looking forward to bringing more Silent Hill music. Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, the vocalist, she's been singing on the Silent Hill soundtrack since Silent Hill 2. She's not only a vocalist, but a voiceover actress as well, and she's been in tons of stuff like One Piece, Code Geass, tons and tons of animes and films, Cowboy Bebop, Outlaw Star. She's been in Naruto, the Dot Hack series, Digimon Data Squad, Bleach, Glitter Force, Steven Universe. She's had some guest voices in there, as well as Princess Mononoke, Metropolis, Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust. So, she's a voiceover actress, but she's also got an amazing voice. This was kind of, like a more emotional ballad type song, but there are a lot of really kind of rock-oriented songs on the Silent Hill soundtracks as well, and she can really belt them out. So, like Joan Jett style stuff. She's got a really good voice. And so that pretty much does it for our industrial music episode. I would love to hear what you guys think about the music. I understand that obviously not all of these songs are going to appeal to everybody, so I'm really curious to hear which tracks were your favorite, which ones couldn't you stand, if any of these make you want to go and seek out these bands, or if you want to know any more music that's like some of the stuff that you played, feel free to ask us. Head over to our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/PixelTunesRadio. Post in there with any questions that you may have, because I'm kind of a fountain of useless knowledge when it comes to industrial stuff, so I can definitely point you in the right direction if any of these tracks appeal to you. So Todd, we were kind of compiling a little list of maybe other industrial bands outside of VGM that people could check out if they want to check out more stuff. So what are some of your favorite bands that you think people would like?
Yeah, I'm just going to throw a couple names out there. Some of them we mentioned earlier, others we have not. My tastes are very focused, so if what you're looking for is the mid-90s Nine Inch Nails, KMFDM type of thing, a lot of these
rock kind of stuff,
the hard rock, chuggy guitars, etc., kind of industrial, a lot of these will ring true for you. Argyle Park released an album in the mid-90s called Misguided, which is very much that sound that I was looking for at the time. And so as I mentioned before, I looked for a lot of sort of side projects that the artists that put that album together did. If you were interested in looking up more of that kind of stuff, you can look up AP2, Level, and they all sort of house themselves under the moniker NY Posse. They did a lot of sort of one-off songs as under different names, and some internet research can show you all kinds of stuff. Cell Dweller was born from that. Circle of Dust was also Clay's work. Cell 7 released an album in 2010 called Recognition. They're from Amsterdam. They only released one album and then disappeared.
It's really good stuff. You shared that with me.
It's really good stuff.
Yeah.
Shiptaka released an album called Second War in 2007. Similar to Cell 7, they only released the one album and then disappeared. Were never heard from again. Pig, headed by, or really is, Raymond Watts, who was the vocalist for KMFDM for a while. He's done a lot of stuff. He's actually coming out with a new album very soon. And Bile, I mentioned before, is very, very heavy, very chuggy, very loud, noisy industrial music. So if any of that sounds like something you're interested in, check out any one of those or all of those bands.
Cool. Yeah, a few bands that I consider my favorites. Sister Machine Gun. They're kind of almost like a jazz-influenced kind of industrial outfit. Really good drum programming, a lot of horns and cool guitar solos. Lyrics are probably not the best in the world, but the music is really, really good. Pop Will Eat Itself is more of a post-punk kind of band. They used to be on Trent's Nothing label. That's how I discovered them. They've also got some music in the PlayStation game Loaded. They did the title screen music for that. So they're kind of aggressive, almost like rapped British English vocals, like Sex Pistols kind of stuff over industrial beats. Pigface is a group led by Martin Atkins, who is he's been in like tons and tons of industrial bands. He's a drummer, but he created a kind of a super group called Pigface, and again, kind of like KMFDM, but even more so. Every album is a different lineup with tons of members from industrial bands from far and wide. Covenant and Assemblage 23 are kind of like that Air Mech track that we played from Frontline Assembly. More electronic sounding, very smooth vocals, deep and nice synths. Probably a good place to start if you're looking to kind of get into industrial music and you're coming from more of an electronic music background. Mentalo and The Fixer and Wumpscut are both extremely aggressive electronic industrial acts. Huge drums, just growling synths, barked vocals. Like it's like the death metal version of industrial without any guitars whatsoever. So if you're looking for something really heavy, check those guys out. And then Ministry, Decrups, and Firework are three of my favorite industrial metal or rock bands. Ministry's older stuff, like Psalm 69, Land of Rape and Honey, that's the really good stuff, the stuff that I'm really into. Nowadays, they're like super sludgy, and don't start with the new stuff. Like Filth Pig and Back, I think, would be like their best work in my opinion.
Yeah, Filth Pig is kind of where it
Filth Pig got really, really heavy.
Yeah.
The stuff before that, like Psalm 69, is like probably a good place to start with them if you want to listen to some good industrial
Definitely
rock.
Psalm 69 is iconic of where they were at that time.
Totally. And then Decrups is kind of like, it's like industrial light almost. It's a good band to start with if you're coming from a rock or a metal background. They use a lot of programmed drums and chuggy staccato guitars, but they don't really go so noisy. So they're a much more listenable kind of industrial rock act. So yeah, check those guys out. Again, check us out, facebook.com/groups/PixelTunesRadio.
If you want more, we can provide you with more.
If you want more, we can provide you with more.
We're just giving you a handful of bands. We don't want to load you up on a million things.
Exactly.
But as Ed said, he, and to a lesser extent, I am a fount of useless industrial knowledge.
And Todd unfortunately doesn't have a Facebook account, so if you have questions for him, I can always forward them to him. That's not a problem at all. Check out my other podcast at impulseproject.info. Me and my buddy Brian, we do demo scene music and music from the tracking community, so you'll hear a lot of Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum. We just introduced FM chips onto that show, so you'll hear some homebrew Genesis style FM songs. So we do that. That comes out about once every 2 weeks. We don't have a real release schedule for that. Check us out on Twitter at pixeltunesradio.com. And Todd, we can't find you anywhere on the web, so no plugs.
What's that?
All right. Again, we will see you back here in 2 weeks. We'll have a special guest on with me next episode. Mike will still be off running around and getting rings put on his finger, so we'll leave him to that. All right. Check us out on iTunes as well. Leave a rating and a review. Help us get some more visibility. Thank you for being on the show, Todd.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Filling in for Mike. He's got big shoes to fill, and you've filled them quite well. See you in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening. Peace out.